Well, I'm very happy to be back with Jean-Michel Caffin, who I spoke to, I don't know, but it's about a year ago. Because Jean was in the RLI, came out to Rhodesia, and so we were talking about the war. But now I want Jean to do something for us on our history series and talk a bit about Morocco, which is where he was born, a country that I know very little about, but I'd like to know more. Jean, welcome, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Hannes, for having me, and that's a topic which is still close to my heart. So I'm very pleased that you took interest in that country. My connection in Morocco, as you said, is I was born there in 1953. I was born there because even though I'm from a French family, Morocco became a French protectorate in 1912. Both my grandfathers arrived in Morocco at that time. One was an officer in the French army, so he took part in the conquest of Morocco, which, by the way, took about 25 years, took a long time. And my father's father was an engineer. He came from a family of small industrialists, and he was the rebellious son of the family, the kind of son that you would send off to the colonies to try and do something with his life. And then he went into farming. So really, the history of my family in Morocco began in 1912. As I said, that's when it came under French administration.
Jean, let me just ask you, the actual occupation, did that involve violence? Was there a confrontation? You talk about conquest.
Yes, it was. It was an interesting context because, in essence, again, this was a protectorate. So the French had signed an agreement with the Sultan, which is now called the King of Morocco, so to help the Moroccan monarchy to regain control of the country. So it was not a pure colonial occupation. It was truly in support of this French monarchy, in agreement with a number of European powers. But the country at the time was divided up into a number of tribes who were resisting the authority of the Sultan. And the French, this conquest was about regaining control of all the different regions and tribes in Morocco, officially on behalf of the King of Morocco, but also because France, who occupied the territory next door, Algeria, wanted a more stable country on its borders. So yes, and that lasted from 1912, in effect from 1907 to 1934, when the last pocket of resistance was reduced in the Atlas Mountains. But by then, most of Morocco had been put under control, and the European settlement was already 20 years in existence.
So, so it was a low-grade sort of counterinsurgency war.
No, it was quite serious. It was quite serious at the time. The Moroccans, particularly the Berbers, who form the majority of the population, they are actually native of Morocco before the Arab invasions. They are fierce fighters, very brave soldiers. In fact, if you read the story of the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy during the war, Second World War, they were very, very effective troops. So yeah, it took a long time. And again, these were different warring factions. There were different tribes, and you had to submit one tribe at the time. It wasn't just a nationwide resistance. It was more, localized and tribal. So it took all that time. It took 20 years altogether.
And so as the French established themselves and imposed their authority on the colony or the protectorate, did they rule in conjunction with the Sultan, or was he marginalized, and was there now a French governor or similar official who was actually running the territory?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I'll step back a bit and explain how and why the French went into Morocco.
Right.
At the beginning of the century, I think all of Africa, at least coastal Africa, had been divided up between the different European powers. France, Britain, the German as well, the Italian. So I think practically, or the entirety of coastal Africa was already in European hands. Morocco, to my knowledge, was probably the last territory which was still independent. Morocco being at the crossroad of Africa and Europe, just south of Spain, and also controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, was of very high strategic importance. And a number of powers wanted to obviously occupy Morocco, at least have influence there. The French were already in Algeria. They've been there for 70 years. And they were already in Tunisia. So they said, well, we have a legitimate right to occupying Morocco. It's part of French North Africa.
Right.
The Germans were very interested, and there was a lot of diplomatic tension between the powers. And eventually there was a treaty that was signed in Spain, the Treaty of Algiers, which decided of the fate of Morocco. And that was Britain, France, and remember, all these powers were rival at the time. So it was decided that Morocco would be entrusted to the French, except the northern part of Morocco, which would go to Spain. And in addition, there is a city called Tangiers, which was on the Strait of Gibraltar. And because of its strategic importance, it was decided that that city, therefore that port, would not be given to anyone. And it became an international city run by several powers. So that's basically the stage in 1911. They've decided this is how they're going to divide up the country. France comes in and it's given a mandate to oversee Morocco. So to answer your question, the Moroccan monarchy is left in place. But you have to remember, at the time when the French arrived, the Sultan controlled nothing. He controlled a few thousand square miles around the capital city. So basically, he had no effective power. But in essence, the treaty said this is a French protectorate. The French will come and they will leave once the country is stabilized. That was a typical scenario in those days. And then you came in and then you stayed forever, obviously. So there was a French administration, but involving the traditional Moroccan system with what they call pashas, which are the governor of cities. And you have a dual administration, but the real modern, effective, functional administration was French, while keeping all the Moroccan structures. A bit like in Rhodesia, you still have the chiefs in place. So it was very similar to that. You had both flags flying always, the French flag and the Moroccan flag. And officially, it was a dual administration. In essence, the French were pretty much controlling everything. And what changed is that a protectorate was supposed to light a presence. But then the country was opened up for colonization. And hundreds of thousands of French people went into farming, into everything. The two administration was joint, but in effect the control was French, and the French had not given any date in the future when they would leave.
Okay, and so what transpired in Morocco during the First World War? Were they left out of it, or was there?
No, that's interesting because, as I said, the French arrived in 1907, first to protect the French. There had been some attacks on what happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is that in a number of coastal towns, there was a small European population that started coming in, while Morocco was still, independent. And on a regular basis, there would be some attacks on those people. And there was such an attack in 1907, which justified, quote unquote, the French intervention. So the French came in and occupied an area between 1907, in fact, around Casablanca, the main city where I was born, in 1912. 1912, the French have an official mandate. And this is where they go deep into Morocco in order to pacify. That was the term. It was the pacification of Morocco. This is how they called it, not the conquest. And they started occupying all this. So, as I said, bit by bit, each region, each tribe was defeated. That's interesting because 2 years later, 1914, First World War breaks out. And after 2 years of combat, some of the tribes that had been defeated offered troops to the French to fight in Europe. There is a system, a code of honor in the Moroccan society, which the French respected and exploited. If and when a tribe was defeated militarily, there would be an official surrender, which was followed by an official pardon. So the French said, you know, you fought honorably, you've been defeated, now we give you a pardon and let's be friends. And many of those tribes immediately supplied troops. So they formed immediately what was called the Moroccan Rifles. And those Moroccan Rifles, 2 years after, as I said, the beginning of the conquest, were sent. They were all volunteers, of course, and fought. They fought in the war in Europe. And that continued. As each tribe was defeated, it was pardoned, and they would usually supply troops to the French, because these are warrior tribes, okay? That's their life. And for them, serving the French was not a betrayal. It was just a trade. You know, you fought a war, and they were very loyal, very disciplined, very brave. You know, just like our Rhodesian African Rifles, very same situation.
Interesting. So, Jean, would you say that the French occupation was a benevolent authoritarian type of rule? I mean, colonialism's got such a bad name now, but in actual fact, in many of these countries, these European powers brought stability and structures which actually assisted the populace. Would you say that was true of the Moroccan occupation?
Of course, if you ask a Moroccan, he might not agree with you. But again, as I said, these are people who, as they were conquered, decided that they would make the best of it. So what the French did, they just decided, as I said, all of a sudden they realized that Morocco had a lot of potential. Morocco, and I remember talking with my grandfather about this, in 1912, except for a few coastal cities which had contact with Europe, it was pretty much a medieval society and medieval country. Now, Morocco had been a brilliant and prosperous and very advanced kingdom and empire centuries ago. You have to remember that Spain was occupied by the Arabs for 700 years. And amongst those occupiers, there were a number of Moroccan tribes. In those days, Morocco had a brilliant civilization. And to the extent that they were able to go and conquer part of Europe. But all this had, the region, the country had gone into decline after 1492. And really the country had just gone back to the Middle Ages. So it was not at all what it was a few hundred years ago. The French came in, looked at this country, saw the potential, the farming potential, the mining potentials. And I would say, selfishly, they decided this needs to be exploited, this needs to be developed, and we're going to do it, whether the Moroccans like it or not. Okay, so that was pretty much, the colonial mindset. But as you know, in the process, they built towns, they built roads, they built bridges, they developed mines, they built dams, they did and within 20 years, Morocco was transformed. At least I would say the western half of Morocco, and modern cities appeared, and with all the infrastructure, railroads and roads and everything you can imagine, and also in terms of agriculture, a lot of land was not properly cultivated or even left idle, and the French came in. Like my grandfather, he bought from local Moroccan peasant farmers. He bought pieces of land, put them together, and just decided to go into citrus farming. And before that, there was nothing. There was just, and again, as I said, he bought that land. There was no seeds of land. There was some region, to be fair, where if the tribe resisted and did not accept French authority, that some land will be confiscated and distributed to settlers, to French settlers. But in many other areas, like where we were, it was a willing buyer, willing seller system. And this is how our own farm was developed. We had 300 acres of citrus in coastal Morocco. So pretty much the same pattern of economic development, in that region, bringing everything that comes with it. And I guess, some frustration and some, disagreement from the local population. But at the same time, cities were being built. There were hospitals. There were all kinds of things that the population benefited from, employment. And one important point, obviously, there was absolutely no racial segregation system put in place. Absolutely not. Again, first of all, that was never the case in the French colonies anywhere, even in sub-Saharan Africa. But in the case of Morocco, even less, because as I said, it was a joint administration. So there was absolutely, Moroccan kids, those who wanted could put their kids in the French schools and that kind of thing. There was no, even in the, where the cities were built, typically in Morocco, you would have the ancient town, the ancient Moroccan town, and what they call, they would call it the modern city. It was the French quarter built next to it. So you would not, there was an insistence on the part of the French not to touch, not to destroy anything that pertained to Moroccan culture and past civilization. So you would have a walled city with all its components, and the French city would be built just next to it, but it was not reserved to the French. Anybody who could reach the level of economic achievement could live there. There was also in Morocco there was a large Jewish community in Morocco.
Large what?
That'd been there for thousands of years.
What community?
So Jewish community.
Right.
And that community was the first one to adopt French customs and education and everything else. They immediately saw they were in not a very good place, in a place like Morocco. They were tolerated, but they didn't have all the civil rights of the Muslim Moroccans. Like it was the case in many places in Europe. They were discriminated against. They were barred from many professions and other occupations. And that Jewish community saw that by going towards French education, French system, they could progress, and they did that. So the Jewish community very quickly adopted French education, the French language, and because they saw that this was their future, if you want. So that colonization was not brutal at all in terms of opening these opportunities to the native population. Okay, everybody could if they wanted to, and slowly Moroccans did that. The people from the wealthier families started sending their children, their boys and even their girls, to French schools. So this is sort of how this osmosis took place.
Jean, you mentioned mining and agriculture, what was it that caught the French eye from an economic perspective, as a way, to develop the country? What sort of investment took place?
I think originally nobody knew what there was in Morocco because the country was completely closed. Okay. But as they came in, you had two types of colonization in Morocco. You had big companies from Europe that came in, big conglomerates, and they started, buying large tracts of land and looking for mines and all kinds of different activities, industries. And then you had individual settlers who came in as well. The French, as I said, had been in Algeria next door for 70 years. So they replicated a bit the economic development. They went in and they found, there was a lot of mining potential. Agriculture, again, they were large tract of land, and they knew that you could grow citrus, for instance, in those places. Up to the north, you could have all kind of cereals and that kind of thing. And so slowly, the potential was studied and exploited. The interesting thing about Morocco, also the colonization of Morocco, is that that treaty I mentioned to you, the Treaty of Algeciras, said, okay, France will be given the mandate over Morocco. But in terms of trade, Morocco will have to be open to the rest of the world. So it won't be a French preserve, if you want. Because Algeria was essentially supplied from France. That's it. It was a part of France, and you would not, in those days, as you know, there were a trade barrier. That played a very important role in Morocco because these are the years where America was emerging as the first modern power in the world. And the French Moroccan pretty much turned to America for everything they wanted to do. And so for us, that was the example. An interesting thing is that in Morocco, the rest of France was very, basically everything was domestic, the industry, there were still trade barriers. In those days, countries did not really, European countries didn't have trade with each other. Morocco turned to, and they used to call it, Morocco was France's California. So for instance, on our farm, and anywhere else, we had American tractors, we had American cars. Casablanca started growing and looking like an American city with skyscrapers, things that you didn't have in France. And it was a strong American, there was no American presence, but there was a strong American influence in the way that country developed. And that went on until the 1950s. So that was a big difference. And I think I told you before that for me, Morocco was unique in that sense. It wasn't just one of the traditional, very French colony where the French brought in the typical, bureaucracy and their way of doing it. It was completely different. And for me, when I studied the history of Rhodesia, which we know was a unique experience in the British Empire, there are a lot of similarities. This pioneer spirit, people just being very adventurous, but at the same time well organized. The immigration that went from France to Morocco was also selective, just like the system that Rhodesia had at the time, as you know. Not anybody could go and settle in Rhodesia. The same system was more or less. So it was a different form of colonization, and it was very rapidly successful. But that American model was pretty much what prevailed in the way things were being done, because there were American companies coming in, and then, as I said, we drove American cars, we have American equipment, and the same mindset, the same spirit, which what made the colonization of Morocco very different from the rest of the French Empire.
Sean, just tell us the background to the Spanish Sahara and the ongoing dispute about who owns what, that's also connected to the occupation of Morocco, is it not?
Absolutely. What happened is that, as I said to you, up to the 19th century, and before that, Morocco was a vast empire that stretched all the way down across to sub-Saharan Africa. So the Moroccans had, kind of colonized themselves, part of, Mauritania, Senegal, and of course, what is now Western Sahara. However, as I also told you, by the time the French arrived, they had no longer control. So on paper, it was part of Morocco, more or less, but they had lost control of these regions, a couple of centuries before that. Some tribes would pay allegiance to the Moroccan Sultan, others wouldn't. So when the French came into Morocco with the Spaniards, they realized that there was a part of Morocco that could be controlled, but the part in the Sahara was basically just, some nomadic tribes. So it was decided that south of Morocco, along the Atlantic region, would be given to the Spanish. So the Spaniards had the northern fringe of Morocco, and then they had that part stretching from the south of Morocco all the way to what is today's Mauritania. The French already occupied part of the Sahara because they had infiltrated the Sahara from Algeria in the north and gone into the south. So that eventually resulted in Morocco being defined as the area between Algeria and the Atlantic, and the rest was divided up, I guess, between the French and the Spaniards. Spanish Sahara, as it was called in those days, was a large territory with a very small population. So the Spaniards occupied that. When Morocco was given independence in 1956, the French part went, the northern French of the country became independent. The city of Tangiers, from international cities, became a Moroccan city again. But the question of the Spanish Sahara was not solved. So the Spaniards stayed there, and Morocco kept claiming that territory. But there was an agreement that was signed, and the Moroccans had accepted that. Okay, we give you independence, but we keep the Spanish Sahara. So Morocco was independent in 1956. By 1974-5, Moroccans started claiming that territory again. But there was inside the territory, some of the tribes had organized themselves into some form of liberation movement. But again, very sparse population, maybe 100,000 people, not very effective. Spaniards had a large garrison there. They had their own foreign legion, and that country was going nowhere. It was going to stay in Spanish, under Spanish rule, despite Moroccan claims. But those claims were disputed by Algeria. Algeria had become independent by then, and they were disputing Moroccan claims over that part of the Sahara. So you had a bit of a gridlock there. And in 1976, Moroccan organized quite a spectacular operation. The King of Morocco had a very good idea. And he said, we're gonna have a peaceful occupation of Spanish Sahara. And they organized, they brought in 350,000 people, civilians, men, women, children. They marched on the border, which basically is strictly, absolutely a line in the sand. That's what it is, because that territory is arid, it's desert, okay? And they said on this date, I think it was March 76, something like that, these 350,000 people, unarmed, are going to start a peaceful march into Spanish Sahara. It's going to be the most peaceful conquest or reconquest ever. And they did that. And the Spaniards lined up their troops along the border. But what do you do when you have 350,000 civilians and armed? There wasn't a troop inside, and they walked towards you. What do you do? At the same time, the Spanish president, Franco, was dying. He had a stroke and he was in hospital dying. So there was a vacuum of power in Spain. And this happened at the same time. The Spaniards kind of panicked. They realized they could not, obviously not, shoot at unarmed civilians. So they pulled their troops back and then they started negotiating for withdrawal, which they did. And the Moroccans said, okay, this is ours. We're going to take it back. But then Algeria said, no, it's not yours. It belongs to the tribe, the people of Spanish Sahara. Moroccans said, yeah, but those people used to be Moroccan. So they're going to be Moroccan again. All right. So this is our territory. This is ancestral territory. And this population used to be under French Moroccan rule. And they will now come back into the fold. And this is how the Western Sahara conflict started in 1976 and still has not been resolved. So Morocco took occupation of the territory. Algeria and about 50% of the African countries objected to it. And this is where we are. It's a stalemate at this stage. The situation has never been solved. Morocco says, you take an official map of Morocco and it shows Morocco and the former Spanish Sahara. Other people said, no, this is a country that is waiting to be independent. That's where we are at this stage.
Jean, tell us what, at the height of the French occupation, for want of a better word, what was the population? How many French people actually ended up living in Morocco?
At the peak of, we're talking about the mid-50s, just before independence, I believe about 350,000.
About the same as Rhodesia.
More, I think wasn't Rhodesia about 270,000, I think.
Yeah, I think, yeah, about that, yeah.
And then you had also a lot of, the French allowed other Europeans to come into Morocco. So you had large contingents of Spaniards, Italians, Portuguese, so maybe up to 500,000. At the time, the population of Morocco, obviously in 1950, was, I think, under 10 million. So it was quite significant in proportion, particularly in the urban areas. Some cities had very large European, population. So you had about, if I remember well, about 8,000 farmers. So you multiply by family, so 10% population of the French population was involved in farming, but mainly urban. Casablanca had become a big city by then, and probably a good third of the population of the European population was in Casablanca, and in other cities as well. So it was quite significant, but yeah, comparable to what it was in Rhodesia, I would say, comparable to that.
Interesting. John, and during the Second World War, what actually transpired in Morocco?
Same thing as what happened in Morocco. Okay, so it's always a bit complicated, but when France was occupied by the German, they signed a peace treaty with the German, and half of France was left with independence. Was the Vichy France, which occupied the southern part of France, and the rest of France was occupied by the German. Morocco fell under the Vichy France control until 1942. But what happened is that the Americans planned a first landing as they were planning the reconquest of Europe against the Nazis. The first actual landing was in Morocco. So in 1942, I think November 1942, a large Allied invasion force landed in Morocco.
Right.
There was the Vichy France was officially against the Allies, so there was some slight resistance. In fact, my father was in Casablanca. He was at school when the Americans arrived all of a sudden. Then they were, planes in the skies and naval bombardment and that kind of thing. But very quickly, the French governor, surrendered, if you would, and the Americans then quickly occupied the Morocco, and then Algeria, and then Tunisia. So this is how they went. And from there, they moved into Italy. So for 2 years, Morocco was still controlled by the French, but from out of Vichy. And so against de Gaulle, who was in England with what was called the Free French.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was quite a strange situation.
John, just switching slightly, Algeria. When did the resistance to French rule turn militant, and when did that problem start?
Okay, as you know, throughout all the colonial empires, the trouble started after the Second World War. When many countries started claiming their independence. So Algeria was not even considered as a French colony. It was part of France. It was entirely part of France. Even though only 10% population was of European stock, the rest was a native Arab Muslim. There were 1 million French people in Algeria, quite a large population, 1 million. And they'd been there for 130 years, okay? So it was, in the French people's mind, government, that was a fait accompli. This will not change. And in 1954, you saw the first acts of resistance and terrorism, and then that started spreading. They were both unorganized groups, people who took up arms, and again, those people in Algeria and Morocco in the mountains, they are warrior tribes, so they started uprising against the French. And then you had help coming in after 1956 from Morocco and Tunisia, having become independent in 1956. They started harboring training camps, like Mozambique and Zambia used to do. So that's what happened. Just for your information, in Morocco, these troubles started in 1953. That's the year I was born. And there wasn't a violent war like there was in Algeria. In fact, we call them the events. That's what it was called in French, the events. So that lasted from 1953 to 1956. There were some isolated attacks. There wasn't a large organized insurrection. It was just a small group of people. There were some bombs that were planted in Casablanca in different places. For instance, I think Christmas night, 1955, when people were doing the Christmas shopping, there was a bomb placed in Casablanca in the main market, and there were a lot of people killed. There were a couple of small French settlements, mining settlements, that were attacked by local tribes. There was one particular one. There was a relative of ours, a small town. There was about 100. There was a few hundred people living in that town, of which 100 were killed during that one-day attack. So you had this. So for 3 years, you had those troubles. As I said, I was born in 1953, but I can tell you, I remember I probably was 3 years old. We lived on the farm. My father putting a camouflage jacket and taking his shotgun and going with his brothers just to patrol the farm. We would go, when we would go shopping in town, he had his pistol in the holster. And we, as a small child, you hear the stories, which are still with me, the stories. And for instance, I remember something vividly. is, and I must have been no more than 3, because this is towards the end. There was a rumor that there was a large group that was going to attack farms where we lived. For some reasons, well, the reason is that our farm was perched on top of a hill. So a lot of farmers from the region with their families came to our home. And I remember they were sleeping everywhere in the house, camping in the house, because we were supposedly the safest farm in the area. And we had to defend ourselves. There were no troops around or anything like that. And this has stayed with me. And as I said, I must have been just 3 years old. And I remember my parents talking about that thing called terrorists. And, we heard them, and we knew there was something sinister about it, So these are the days I remember. So that's in Morocco, 53 to 56. In Algeria, the insurrection starts in 54, ends in 62, when the French government decided, de Gaulle said, and the French had literally won that war, but they decided that politically they did not want to keep Algeria as part of France. So that's what happened, yeah.
So militarily, they were on top, the French in Algeria.
I'm sorry?
Militarily, the French were on top in Algeria when they handed over power.
Yeah, they had defeated the insurrection for a number of reasons. Now, the French poured in 500,000 people into Algeria, military. And what they did also, because everything was coming, the support was coming from Morocco and from Algeria. Morocco to the west, Tunisia to the east, training camps and weapons. And the French built 2 barrages, as we call them, along the borders. So they sealed the borders. They built, there was just mining, mines and fence, a bit like we had that cordon sanitaire, but that was far more hardened, and then they would, so whenever there was a group of infiltrators, the French had massed several, regiments along that border, and they would just strike them. So internally, that the insurrection was dying because it had no resupply from outside. The French had started making a number of reforms. So the tide was turning, the population was tired of the war. So they had literally defeated the insurrection militarily. But politically, it was decided that this was not, in the long term, it was not tenable. And de Gaulle single-handedly decided, no, we're not going to stay in Algeria. This is not French territory. These people are not French. So a lot of people from the French community in North Africa are very resentful of de Gaulle for having taken the decision, because that's led to a chaotic exodus of 1 million people out of Algeria within a couple of months. Pretty much like what happened in Mozambique. Pretty much. Morocco was different. Morocco, we had those events, we had those troubles, but within 3 years, it was finished. After all, the idea was that Morocco would resume its independence when the French had done their work, and they did. So my family stayed in Morocco. Nothing happened. People started leaving, going to France. Jobs, like the whole civil service was basically replaced by Moroccans. But we, as farmers, had nowhere to go. So we stayed. And so in about 1956, as I told you, there were probably 350,000 French people in Morocco. By 1973-4, about still 100,000 left, including farmers, mainly farmers, but also people in all walks of life. Pretty much like, Zimbabwe after independence. And what happened is that in 1974, the government was under pressure. Things were not going right. So they decided that they needed scapegoat. So they said, okay, to begin with, we are going to take over all the land owned by foreigners. And that was death knell, because we had never taken Moroccan citizenship. There's hardly anybody, maybe a handful of French people living in Morocco who had taken up Moroccan citizenship. So they passed a law saying no foreign national can own farming land. So that was it. So these farms were taken over by the state and turned into state farms. And the other thing was what they call Moroccanization. Anybody who had a business needed to appoint a 51% Moroccan shareholder. And that was the next thing. So that 100,000 strong French community within 2 years was down to that 20,000. And that's where we lost our farm. That's when we lost our farm.
Okay, interesting. And the country today, how would you describe it? Is it reasonably stable, reasonably successful?
It has kept in the Western camp, so to speak. Morocco developed tourism a lot. So that's a major source of income. That wasn't so much the case when the French were there. Yes, there was some tourism, but in those days, the average Frenchman, European, did not travel to all destinations. It was wealthier people who could come to Morocco and spend time, in the summer or in the winter. So Morocco developed tourism, and basically things kept going okay. Then when they nationalized the farms, that of course was a blow to agriculture, because all those modern farms, all those commercial farms, as you can imagine, they declined, all of them, within a couple of years. But then Morocco went into, they decided that they didn't have any mass nationalization. And there also was a whole class of Moroccan business owners. So Morocco kept a capitalist system, encouraged tourism, remained open to the West. And as a result, it hasn't been affected by, the rise of these Islamic movements that you've seen in other Arab countries. It's still a monarchy, it's an absolute monarchy. Well, yeah, there are elections, there's a prime minister, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much the king that controls everything. So he's managed, and his father before, not to let any Islamic movement come to prominence, and just kept the country is very supported by France, by the United States. So it's still pretty much in the Western camp. Moroccan society has changed, and there's been, we've seen, more a return to religion that comparable to what you've seen in other Arab Muslim countries. Not necessarily good news, as you know, we've seen elsewhere. But all in all, the country has continued to progress. Moroccans, the Moroccan elite kept sending their kids to French schools to these days. And these students are very, very successful. They go back to Morocco. They go to France to study. They don't stay in France. They go back to Morocco, and they contribute to the country's development. So that's a good thing about Morocco compared to other countries in the Arab world.
Well, very interesting, Jean. Thanks very much for your time. I've certainly learned quite a bit today, and I'm sure a lot of other people will too.
Well, my pleasure. It's an interesting topic, and I'm fond of history. So, and I was fortunate to know my one grandfather, but also my parents talked to us a lot about the days when they were young and how things went. So that's why I have this knowledge now. It's basically mainly from the family, of course, having read, but there's nothing like hearing it from people who were there at the time and explain what they did, what their mindset was, what the parents thought, how they got there. That's all that, the same thing probably with your own history, family history. So I'm glad I could educate, quote unquote, some people of another colonial experience, in a way a bit comparable to Rhodesia, in other words, different. But at the end of the day, we all belong to the same white tribe of Africa,
Yes, all a bit scattered around the world now, sadly.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
absolutely.
we've all
Now,
got...
the interesting thing about the French, this is the main difference to end this, to finish. The big difference about the French colonials is that, or rather, I don't know whether it's French colonial or colonial French. Basically, the French people who lived in the colonies, okay, is that they always remained French. They always felt French. And when those countries became independent, most of them returned to France. They didn't go anywhere else.
Mm.
They had kept the ties with France. My entire family is back in France, okay? In 1950, they were all together, the extended Caffin family, we were probably 80 people living in Morocco. I'm the only one who doesn't live in France, okay? Contrary to the Rhodesian who are all over the place in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, South Africa. So that major thing is that all 99% of the French who lived in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and other African countries, we're talking about 2 million people, okay, in the 1950s, 2 million, all went back to France. That's the big difference.
Well, they were lucky. The French were lucky they had somewhere to go to. Us guys didn't all have somewhere to go to when it all went bad.
They were not really welcome back in France, I can tell you that. We had different accents. We had a different history. A lot of people looked down on us. A lot of people considered we were, bad, racist, and sort of thing. So these people, starting from the mid 50s to the early 60s, when they returned to France, they were not welcome.
Interesting. Well, thanks, Jean.
Thank you, Hannes.
Appreciate it. And
my pleasure.